Okay, so what we're going to do now is actually cover this book. Now, part of this technique that I'm going to be showing you today is the specific type of technique on the cover finish that I did on a cover, sorry, that made it look quite leather-like and quite antique-like. Now, the way I went about doing that is I used a piece of wrapping, brown craft wrapping paper. This came in a, or this was something that I ordered, that was delivered, was wrapped in this, and I kept it, and that's what I ended up using. And it's one of the thicker versions of this sort of wrapping paper. It is craft, and so if you can find something similar, you'll be able to use that. Okay, so I'm making my cover, so I'm putting glue all over this bit. This is what will be the facing cover on the outside, which is where I usually put my Tyvek or stability. So this bright bit of orange, it's Tyvek, it's a non-rip product, usually used in asbestos suits. You can also buy it as sheets. I have found that using it or like a piece of thin cotton poplin also helps, also works quite well for that flexibility and stability, because if you use paper instead, there's always the likeliness that the paper is just going to start wearing down and will eventually break. Pardon me, I have a bit of a frog in my throat today. This is a brayer, it's a rubber roller. It's usually used in printmaking. I use it to squish out the bubbles and to distribute glue quite nicely as well. Now comes the fun bit. When you've glued it to this degree, I like to give it a bit of a bend, fold it, because if you allow it to dry open, you may find that you won't be able to close it because this hinge area and this hinge area within the spine have become solid. So when the glue is still dry, and yes, I use wet glue, I don't use a lot. That's why I use a applicator or dispenser with a small nozzle, because I can control how much glue comes out. So the best thing to do at this point is allow this to dry for a good 5-10 minutes. Okay, now I've left that to dry for a little while. One thing I want to put your mind at ease right now is you're going to notice that your paper's going to go a little wrinkly. Don't fret. And don't try and get that flat right now. Just don't worry about it. If you're using wet glue, it's going to buckle the paper because that paper is absorbing the water. And what happens is it will buckle. And say hello to my pussycat. So don't worry about it right now. Just let the thing dry. I've let it dry enough that I'm happy with how it's sort of feeling, so I'm going to carry on. So now the next bit, if I can find a slicey thing, is I like to cut my corners. So I've created a tool. You can find tutorials on how to make this tool. It is just made out of a bit of scrap, boxboard, chipboard, whatever you want to call it, same stuff that this cover's made out of. It helps you miter your corners so that you have a nice 45-degree angle. And you just slide it over the corner as such. and with your pencil. I actually tend to cut it right now with my scalpel or cutting tool, but I'm going to do it this way because I'm going to show that you're able to also, you know, if you're not comfortable using a penknife or a scalpel or a craft knife or whatever they want to call them, you can also cut these using a pair of scissors. So I've marked my 45 degree, and all you do is you go through and you just cut it. And Delta is like right there, just watching me work. This is not uncommon at all. Okay. And get rid of the paper. So we have these beautiful corners now. Now I'm going to come in a little bit closer because I want to show how I get a really nice engineered corner. Now with this tool we've got our 90 degree, which is the corner of the cover, and then there's about 5 mil, if that, ruler. It's about 3 mil. 3 millimeters from that corner to the miter cut. And what that gives me is it gives me a little bit of overhang on the corner. And that helps to create a nice engineered corner. So how I go about doing the flap over is I put a bead of glue right on that edge, and then I put it through the flap of paper that is going to be flapped over. And what I do is I slowly push it very gently. I'm not manhandling it because I've done that before and I've destroyed journals and covers and have to redo it. Okay, so what I've got now is I've got a nice corner here, and what I do is I slide my nail, if you have a nail. If you don't have a nail, you can use your ruler, you can use a piece of chipboard, but you want to tuck it on that edge of the board, so the bit that's sitting up. And you're going to do that top and bottom. Now don't worry if there's a little bit of overhang of glue, because it's all going to get covered up. A little bit of glue down the edge. And we flip that up, and again I'm using this sort of pushing motion. You're going to go look outside the window again. And I give this little tucking. I tend to like actually having a tiny little bit of glue in there, so when I do that first bead I make sure that there's a tiny little bit of extra that's going to overflow. So I've engineered those corners. So as you've noticed, I tend to start from the outside. I do sides first, and then I do top and bottom. Top and bottom are the same. Bead of glue. And I've stopped about somewhere within a centimetre from the corner, because I know that this corner I don't want extra glue sort of seeping out right on the corner of that book cover. I'll do one at a time. Slow and steady wins the race. You see how nice that edge just folds over. It takes a bit of practice, so if you don't get it right on your first go, perseverance, try again. Took me a couple goes until I was able to do it confidently and competently. So I think in our society we tend to watch other people do things and go, oh wow, you know, I want to do it that well first time off. Doesn't work like that. You need to practice at things. And although this is just paper craft, it still requires a bit of practice. So I had a little bit much glue on that top bit. So I'm just giving that glue on the top and bottom a bit of love. Now, one thing I have just realized is I haven't transferred my holes through. I will be doing that off screen, off camera, and but I'll show you how I do it on this side. So once you have done this bit, what you're going to do is you're going to let it dry. Now, the reason I say that is watch these two pieces. If we try bending this now while it's wet, it's not going to work. So you give that a little bit of love, you make sure it's down. You can weight it, so a big old phone book, a big old book, something heavy. You can also do a couple books and some dumbbell weights, just to make sure that the paper is, you know, gluing down. So I'm going to let that dry, and we're going to carry on with the next bit, which will be the holes, and then the holes in the signatures. So I've let this dry substantially, and also as soon as I realized it was in a good place to be bent, it was a good time to start bending it. What I've done is I've gone in with a bone folder, or you can go in with a stylus or something, or even like a credit card, and just push these bits of the flap that's come over just into that groove, and it'll start fitting really nicely. You do that on both sides. So at the moment my cover's looking pretty awesome. So the next, as you see, I've transferred my holes at the top and the bottom. So when you're doing this method with the holes pierced through the spine, so what I would generally do before I fold this over is actually do this trick, and actually what you do is you just pierce through. You're not trying to make a full big hole. You're quite honestly just making a marker hole on the back. That's all you're actually trying to do, because that's all you need. You need a guide, because when you sew the pamphlet stitch signatures in, it's going to make the hole bigger. So, but at the moment you really just need a bit of a guide. So that's as far as I'm going to go with that. I am now going to show the technique. So this is the technique I've used to get a rather aged, almost leather look on my cover of this journal. So I'm going to show you how I did it using this. Okay, so let's get started. So what I'm using is Tim Holtz's Distress Stain in the vintage photo colour. I like the vintage photo colour because it's got a little bit more yellow to it. Some people prefer the walnut stain, which is slightly darker. But I tend to go for the vintage photo. You could also use tea dye, I believe. And actually I'm going to mix tea dye. So I like using the vintage photo. So this is the stain, which is in a dauber. And for me, I think this is the key to doing this technique. Because it's going to sort of smudge things around. You can buy plain Dauber bottles, empty Dauber bottles. I think Rangers actually do a empty Dauber bottles. And you could just use the Distress ink and water it down and do the same technique, because I don't think they're making Distress Stain anymore, but I'm not sure. Anyway, so I'm going to close my book cover, and I'm going to cover this. Now, the one thing that helps this technique is if the paper has been crumpled in some ways, because the ink is then going to actually seep in. Now, I don't go too heavy with the ink, I just try and cover it. Where it does go a bit heavy, I will try and blend things out. We're going to do our spine now. Now, the reason why I do this as the book cover is closed or folded is so that you get a nice sort of accent on the hinge, on that folded area. Now, because I don't want to get ink all over my hands, and I'm slowly running out of ink in my Dauber. There's still a bit in there. And the way you activate the Dauber is you actually depress the little mechanism on the inside underneath the foam, and it allows the ink to flow onto the foam, which is the general theory. Now, because this is a book, and because we're going to have bits going over, I always do a little bit of the inside, and I always do the edges. Okay, so now it's important you do it at this stage rather than after you've completed the whole book, because we're going to be covering it in other mediums as well. Now, on the inside, I always come in a bit because of the nature of how we're going to cover the inside. And also I always do the edges just to finish off the effect. What you do now is you leave that to dry, and you need to leave it to dry for quite a while. It needs to be bone dry when you come back to it. Okay, so this is reasonably dry now. What I'm going to do is add a little bit of depth. So to do that, we first used Vintage Photo. So this is when I bring in the walnut stain, which is slightly darker. Now, I'm not going to put this all over. I'm going to put it around the edge of the covers, the spine, and the back. And all I do is, I'm not going to put a lot, and you want to sort of try and blend it. And if you find it's getting a bit heavy in some places, you bring back in your lighter one as a blender. Now at the moment that looks really dark, which for me I don't mind. It's going to come out, but this is where you start working it how you want to get the finish you want. Now I like using the darker walnut stain as the sort of adding a bit of contrast. However, if you look at this piece, there are areas where we went a little bit further, a little bit over a couple times with the vintage photo. So there's nothing stopping you from just in places, instead of going heavy contrast like on this side, you can just use the vintage photo again and build up that color along the edges. That is also quite acceptable. Again, as I said, this is where you need to start figuring out what your end result is going to be. I tend to like having that heavier contrast on the edges. Just get rid of a bit of white lightness in there. Okay, so again, you leave that to dry and we'll come back to it when it is finished. Okay, so the next step is to seal this, and I'm going to use up what I've got of my Mod Podge mat, usually used with decoupage and that sort of thing. I tend to use a different method for myself. I decided to give Mod Podge a try. I find it way too expensive for what it actually is. And my method is actually just sealing with PVA glue, because effectively, in my opinion, Mod Podge is PVA glue with a few extra additives. So what I do is add a bunch to a palette. Now this is a crappy brush that I've been using for mediums and glues and whatnot for ages, so don't use a precious new fancy expensive brush for this. And I give it a reasonable coat, move it around a bit so that you now this is going to start happening where this is going to start happening where it looks like your ink is actually coming up. It technically is, but don't panic. It will settle down once the glue dries. Oh, sorry, once the sealer dries, so the coat of sealer dries. And make sure that you get your edges, as I'm doing at the moment. You make sure you get a good coverage. You can do a second coat. I generally don't. But like on the spine here, I make sure that I have it folded to ensure that I get all of the paper covered, even in amongst the folds. And I'm pretty happy with that. allow this to dry in a slightly folded position. So I've just sort of tented it like a little teepee, and allow it to dry that way, because you don't want it sticking on the corners or sticking on the hinges. And again, we will let that dry and we will come back to it. Okay, so that is dry. I'm quite happy with how that's turned out. I'm going to use this as the actual front of the book, because I like how the effect changed some of that paper in the front. Okay, so I have sewn in all of my signatures. You can see the stitching on the back. And now we're at a point where we want to decide what we want to actually put on the cover of the actual book. And there's a host of possibilities. You could do a book plate. I've also got oval ones. At the moment I'm not sure, so I'm just sort of playing with some ideas. I also, have a rather decent collection of jewelry bits and pieces that you could always do something with. So this is the point where you can start embellishing the book. You can do metal corners, various things like that. So that is a basic pamphlet stitch book. You can translate this into whatever size you want. This is just a small sample version, you could say, but these are also great for little notebooks, commonplace books, quote books, you name it, idea books. They're a great size to fit into a bag. So make sure that you subscribe, and we'll see you on the other side.